It is my privilege, it is my joy to be with you tonight. And I'm going to swap the HDMI cord and bring a PowerPoint up here. I'm going to wear a history teacher's hat tonight with you. Is that all right? I know some of you, when you hear, oh boy, history class, you should have warned me before. Well, that's why I didn't warn you, right? I'll tell you something. History is his story, isn't it? It was going to be called America's 11th Hour. I love this theme of traveling to the city of God, so I changed the title last minute to just Traveling to the City of God. Subtitle, 400 Years of Providence and Prophecy. I love the fall season. You know, it's fall now, right? Are you enjoying the cooler temperatures? Boy, did we have a nice chill in the air. Some of you are thinking that's ominous, but I like it when the leaves start to change. I came down from Michigan today, and the best thing about fall to me is Thanksgiving, actually. And we just got to wait a while for it, don't we? My wife is Canadian. They do it right up there. They've got their Thanksgiving in October. So you don't have to wait till November after the harvest has already been in for a month or two. So we like to gather our apples in September and our butternut squash and shut down the garden pretty much by October. And our favorite holiday as a family is actually October 31. Well, that might have taken you by surprise because you might have grown up thinking October 31 is the devil's holiday. Well, I'll tell you something. October 31 is Reformation Day. That's the best. That's my favorite holiday, not only because of the Protestant Reformation of 1517, but because we do our Thanksgiving dinner as a family, whole food, plant-based, nutritious Thanksgiving dinner on October 31 with some friends and family. Do you remember when we celebrated that 4 years ago now? It was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Do you remember that? 2017, 500 years from 1517. There was another event that was celebrated. I see some people who were alive for this. Do you remember the bicentennial? I was not yet alive at that time, but my mom gave me these special quarters that were minted for 1776 to 1976, and it was a big to-do in America. So as an American history teacher, that's what I used to do for a living before going into ministry. That's where my degrees are, is in the social sciences, history, political science, economics. I love these anniversaries, but I became very, very sad, discouraged. I think I even literally was brought to the moment of reflection and tears in the fact that last year, a major anniversary went by unnoticed. Last year was the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock, and not a peep of it, compared to the big extravaganza nationally that went on a generation ago. What happened? Well, okay, we were distracted with COVID. Let's cut ourselves some slack here, but I grew up in a Christian school. Before I was Seventh-day Adventist, I grew up in a Christian school that heavily emphasized history, and I value that. We learned a lot about the contribution of the black community in American history, the founding fathers, the civil rights movement, a modern founding father, if you will, Martin Luther King Jr., and of course, the Pilgrims and Indians. We dress up. That's just a stock photo, by the way. That's not actually from anybody I know, but you know, I like the Thanksgiving theme. So the first half of the message tonight about American history is just going to focus on them because I want to give us another shot at this. Last year was the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. And yes, it's depressing and a tragic and dark irony that the worship services that were held in 1620 on these shores for the first time, Protestantism coming. 400 years from that, we celebrated that by shutting down churches, didn't we? That was a blow to those who love free exercise of religion. It was also a little bit like a cruel joke that we were also at the 100-year anniversary last year of alcohol prohibition in 1920. 1920, alcohol prohibited. 2020, we're 100 years from that. Churches are closed, but liquor stores are open. Remember that? But let's give ourselves another chance here, because fall of 2021 is the 400th anniversary of the first what? The first Thanksgiving. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Let's open with prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the truth that we have nothing to fear unless we forget how you've led us in our past history. So as we dig into the principles of the foundation of the republic that was risen up through prophecy and through providence, we pray for discernment and wisdom, for an appreciation of the Most High God as we study this story, history, your story. In Jesus' name, amen. Traveling to the city of God, 400 years of providence and prophecy. Now, the beginnings of America were forged in faith and in sacrifice by fearless pilgrims. These were people of England who were poor, who were social outcasts in England. In fact, they were enemies of the state, as we'll get to in just a moment. Hebrews 11 talks of these types as the world was not worthy of them. The Pilgrims, these persecuted ones in England, ended up having more influence on the formation of the freedoms we enjoy and the republic that became the United States of America. They had more influence than all the empires combined who were fighting over their imperial colonial empires. These 51 pilgrims established most of the principles that would become the foundation of America. And today, this surprised me, 10% of Americans today actually literally descend from those 51 pilgrims. I'm not one of them. My ancestors were in the Netherlands at this time. We'll hear about the Netherlands in just a minute, but this is just a beautiful thing that not only 10% of America, but all of us are recipients and inheritors of the principles that they brought, right? So to me, I think everybody, red and yellow, black and white, enjoys themselves a good Thanksgiving dinner, right? So this isn't just for red and white, the Pilgrims and the Indians who celebrated it. So I had the privilege to read this book as a high schooler, Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. It's kind of an interesting coincidence. The high school I was attending was on Plymouth Avenue in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It just dawned on me yesterday for the first time. Well, that's quite a coincidence. But Of Plymouth Plantation is the definitive record of the Pilgrims establishing themselves in Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. William Bradford, being the author of that book, also is the most well-known pilgrim because he served as governor of the Plymouth colony. He was the chronicler of their story and became the preeminent leader of the Pilgrims. Probably many of you have heard of William Bradford. How many have heard of William Brewster, though? He was probably a more important pilgrim. As we go through this story, you'll hear Bradford and Brewster. Don't get them mixed up. I know they both start with B, but we'll be touching on these names. Bradford was later on in the 1620s and into the 30s a more important figure, but early on, William Brewster was the most important leader of the Pilgrims. And his story begins back in England, of course. That's the Pilgrims were the English Puritans, or in this case, Separatists. Brewster had been Cambridge educated, so highbrow intellectual. He had traveled the world. He had become a rather important man. But instead, he chose the humble life of being the postmaster of a tiny little sleepy town called Scrooby in mid-England. It's the position his father had held as well. Now, Mr. Brewster was a man who had a concern and a care for the weak and for those in his jurisdiction who were needy. And one needy young child was named William Bradford. And Brewster reached out to this orphaned, sickly kid and periodically visited him and brought him presents. The most highly valued present that Brewster ever brought to young Will Bradford was a copy of the Bible in English, the Geneva Bible. And the two would study the Word of God together, mentor and young child coming to love and appreciate and peruse in the depths of the Word of God on the frequent visits of his friend, William Brewster. Now, why would they be doing this on their own? Why not just acclimatize themselves to Anglican worship? Well, as sincere students of the Word of God, Brewster and Bradford and a number of others in England were not too happy with Anglican forms of worship. They were viewed as Catholic light. And so these men called Puritans and called Separatists were worshiping on their own and seeking to bring about a purer form of biblical Christianity in England. Now you might say, but isn't the Anglican Church Protestant? Well, these Puritans and Separatists felt that the Anglicanism of their time was just a faux Protestantism, and they indeed were right. Because King Henry VIII, who broke from Rome, did it on false pretenses and never really sought a true Protestant religion. I'm skipping over and skimming over a lot of history that you can read in the Great Controversy and bringing out some things and facts that you won't find in there. So definitely reread the Great Controversy if you haven't in a while. But they began to be persecuted, particularly the Separatists, because there was a plot to blow up the Parliament and kill the king. It was actually a Catholic plot by one Guy Fawkes in 1605. The plot was spoiled. There were 36 powder kegs that were ready to blow up and kill the House of Lords and the king upon his visit. And when they foiled the plot, the king was not too happy about this, of course. The king cracked down after this on all non-Anglicans. If you were not Anglican, you were not permitted to worship according to the dictates of conscience by any means. There was a strong prohibition on forms of worship like William Brewster's in the manor house of Scrooby. He opened up his own manor house to the separatists that had gathered and fled to his little corner of England for freedom of worship. Now, these separatists were public enemy number one. It's 1606, and here they are worshiping in secret to the point where he's putting his job on the line. He's putting his life on the line to be the lay minister of this gathering community of separatists. There were young people, like young Will Bradford, who would literally be outside their worship services in the streets listening to the conversations to see if anybody had a clue that this worship service was going on, because they could not let it get out. And now this way of living was oppressive, and they feared for their lives and that of their children. So they began to lay plans to escape England during this time of persecution by the Anglican Church and the king. If we can just get to the Netherlands, the Dutch are very tolerant of various religious practices. If we can get over there across the English Channel, then we can be free to worship as God is leading us and separate from the Church of England. Well, they made an attempt. The first attempt ended up in betrayal. The captain stole their possessions and betrayed them, and many of the Pilgrim Separatists ended up in jail. Their second attempt, 80 passengers boarded a coal barge to be transferred to a Dutch ship incognito, and the king's officers found out about the escape, caught them, arrested, women and children even imprisoned on that case. Well, the third attempt of separatists to escape from the Scrooby congregation in England to the Netherlands, they finally made it to their home, their new home in Leiden, Holland. Netherlands is also known as Holland. Leiden would be their home for 12 years, from 1608 to 1620. Have you ever heard of Pastor John Robinson? He was featured very heavily in the Great Controversy in the chapter on the Pilgrim Fathers, which I recommend reading. John Robinson was a very important leader of this community now. They've got an actual pastor, and these pilgrims are now getting busy in the Netherlands being missionaries. They fire up the printing press. Brewster is writing tracts, and they're circulating them back in England to try to win more souls, and throughout the Dutch communities in the Netherlands as well. Well, the royal spies of the King of England are so intent on hunting down and persecuting separatists that they literally come over to the Netherlands. They say, we got to find this printing press. Gutenberg's folly is at it again. We can't have these tracts just circulating and people thinking freely to study the Word of God for themselves. So they said, we're going to go find it. They found it. But they didn't find the man behind the printing press. William Brewster had left the Netherlands providentially. You're going to hear that a few times tonight. Left the Netherlands providentially and was in England at the time that they found and shut down his printing press. So he was preserved and was not arrested. Now, what was he doing back in England? Well, The Pilgrims were realizing that Leiden was not their long-term home. The Netherlands was a place that did allow freedom of worship for the time, but it's 1617 now, and they're looking at 1620 as a deadline with a treaty that the Netherlands had with Spain. And in 1620, the freedom to worship may expire in the Netherlands, so we've got to have a backup plan here. And plus, our young people are just being assimilated into Dutch culture and its worldliness, and this just isn't the Pilgrim way. We want a pure life for our family, for our children. So perhaps we should go to this place across the sea that other English colonists have started in Virginia. There's a place called Jamestown that began just 10 years before. But America, how could we even dream of such a thing? That place is ominous. That's the place with saber-toothed tigers and three-headed snakes. That's literally what was said about America at the time. That's the place of unicorns and savages that will skin you every inch and broil you and eat you as savage cannibals. So there was much fear about the notion of going to America. But Bradford, now a young man, steps to the fore, and later on he recounted these words are what that inspired the Pilgrims to take on this challenge. He said, "All great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be both enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. It was granted dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible. It might be that sundry of the things feared might never befall, others by provident care and the use of good means might in a great measure be prevented. These dangers might be prevented if we are careful and God's hand is upon us. And all of these dangers, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be borne or overcome." Can you imagine listening to that speech and then saying, "No, I need to stay in my comfortable Leiden home in the Netherlands"? Well, what would the case fatality rate be for a pilgrim who would go across the sea into a dangerous place? This seems reckless. This seems presumptuous. So they said, we need to submit this to the Lord. They held a day of prayer. Then they held a vote. And the answer came back in the affirmative. We will go to the unknown wilderness of America because God has bidden. We must worship according to the dictates of conscience. That's not even up for the question. We cannot do otherwise. The book, The Great Controversy, says that when God's hand seemed pointing them across the sea to a land where they might found for themselves a state and leave to their children the precious heritage of religious liberty, they went forward without shrinking in the path of providence. Providence and prophecy, 400 years. They sold their property, they raised funds and hired a ship. Do you know what the ship was called? Everybody's about to say the Mayflower. It was called the Speedwell. The Speedwell was to be their ship. Others not of their church were to board the Speedwell as well, and then meet up with the Mayflower. So there would be the Pilgrims and the strangers, as they called the non-separatists, the non-believers, many of them. The Pilgrims and the Mayflower and the Speedwell would meet up, and the families would travel together. Now, families traveling across the ocean like this was unheard of. The Jamestown colonists had gone in search of riches, single young men and such. By all appearances, this move is reckless and presumptuous, but they know that they have submitted it to fervent prayer and that God's callings are enablings. So Robinson, their pastor, bids them farewell in a very heartfelt worship and prayer. Robinson has been called the most important pilgrim who never came to America because he died before he had a chance to join them. He wanted room for these families to go. It was a relief when the two ships finally set sail, because when you're leaving England now, the king's spies, the persecution, remember that whole story. Are we going to be found out? Are we going to be dragged to prison? So they set off and set sail and said goodbye with tearful goodbyes to their previous home. But just out from the port, the Mayflower sees the Speedwell putting out distress signals. The Mayflower shortens her sails and slows down, and the Speedwell catches up. and they learn that the Speedwell is taking on water. So back to a port they go. They do some repairs. They get the Speedwell up to speed, so to speak, and head out again. Now they're 300 miles into the Atlantic. Distress signals again. The Speedwell is not looking good. They go back to port. What is the Lord leading here? Doubts may enter in. She's not seaworthy, they are told. What do we do? There's now been delay after delay. Well, let's cram everybody onto the Mayflower and press on. But not before some sorrow and some discouragement had entered in. The wife of William Bradford, Dorothy Bradford, was overwhelmed with sorrow, weeping, not knowing that their trials were only just beginning and that she herself would perish in the waters being thrown overboard. But William put his arm around his dear wife Dorothy and said, "It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves at home again." And as I read that quote, the thought came to mind, what is home anyway to a pilgrim? What is home anyway? One of the older passengers who couldn't go, his name was Robert Cushman. When he was witnessing the delays and the problems, he said it would be a miracle if the pilgrims made it to America. So the passengers on the Mayflower, there's 102 of them. That's way beyond the capacity of what you would put on a ship like that. 30 of these are children and youth. Only a handful are over the age of 40. There had been a 2-month delay now. Rations are way down, and they're setting sail heading into the stormy autumn season. September 6, with winter to arrive shortly after arrival in America. On the journey, the weather predictably worsened as it does in the fall, and nobody was allowed above deck during those worsening times. 5-foot headroom for all of these pilgrims. This is a cargo ship, after all, not a passenger ship. But morning and evening, those pilgrims worshiped and knelt in prayer. They listened to the Bible stories of God's providence on troubled seas. Can you name a few? There's a number of them. And through the waters of the Red Sea, as the threatening autumn gales blew out of the west, and the ship rose and fell on mountains of water, averaging about 2 miles an hour. Bradford said in his work on Plymouth Plantation that the ship was wickedly shaken. That's a trendy word these days, wicked, right? But indeed, this was literally wickedly shaken. For we know from prophecy that God was raising up a lamb-like nation, and that he was providing a haven, a refuge for the persecuted church. The serpent cast out of his mouth water. What does water represent in Bible prophecy? Multitudes of population. The earth helped the woman. The earth is the opposite of water. This would be a relatively unpopulated or sparsely populated place. That is to be the help of the woman, the church, as the flood of waters are trying to carry the woman away. I guess in this case, the waters are quite literal in trying to literally take this woman down, this church of God down. So singing the Psalms cheered the hearts of the pilgrims, but do you know what it did to the crew and to the strangers in their midst, as they called them, the unbelievers? They couldn't stand the religious piety of these obnoxious Pilgrim Separatists. They would blaspheme the name of the Lord and curse and condemn the Christians aboard. And one of the men threatened to throw half of them overboard. It was impressive to the crew that this very one who threatened to throw half of them overboard himself died on the voyage, one of only 2 to be thrown overboard and perish. And you might say 2 is an awful lot of people out of only 102. That's 2%. That's a high case fatality rate. But that was remarkably and providentially low to only lose 2 souls aboard such a treacherous voyage. To these pilgrims, liberty was as highly valued as life itself. John Howland was one pilgrim who, in a dramatic scene, was swept to sea, plunged under the water, and you're going, he's toast, he's gone, he's perished at that moment. Guess what was right there? One of the lines from the ship was right there as he was in the water. He grabbed it with all his might. The ship goes up onto a wave. He swings up against the ship, and they pull him into the ship. 3 U.S. presidents descended from John Howland as God miraculously preserved his life. At another point in the voyage, an impossible crisis arose. The main beam of the mast cracked. Death was certain for all if that beam couldn't be repaired. Shall we turn around? We're in the middle of the ocean. Where do we go? One passenger brings forth a large iron screw. They don't even know what it was from and why it was on board. It might have been part of a printing press. It might have been part of a jack for lifting roofs on houses. Historians debate that, but they used that screw to repair that mast beam. And they pressed on as Bradford says, they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed. One mother went into labor. Ladies, can you imagine that? On the Mayflower, on the stormy seas of the cold autumn. And you can imagine the cry of that newborn baby as emblematic of a new birth of freedom and Protestantism in the New World. The baby was named, do you know? Oceanus. Oceanus, a fitting name. Well, after 9 weeks on the wild autumn Atlantic, land was overdue. When they finally spotted the land, they sang with gratitude like they had never sung before. Long-awaited Virginia is just ahead. But as they got closer, they thought, wait a minute, this is not what Virginia is supposed to look like. Most of you know they didn't land at Virginia. Why does Scott keep saying Virginia? Well, they meant to be heading for Virginia, but God didn't mean for them to be heading for Virginia because they say, head due south now. What is this place here? We need to get to our destination. In Virginia, head due south. Well, they head due south and approach immediately deadly shoals and breakers upon which the ship will be cast onto the shoals and destroy the ship. It's some of the most treacherous waters off the coast of New England. Then what do? Well, the ship captain, who was not a particularly religious pilgrim, said, pray, pilgrims, as you never have before. And miraculously, you know what happened? Providentially, miraculously, a wind from the south pulls them out of the shoals, and they are now placed in safety. A wind out of the south. They're not going to head south now. They interpret this as God's providence telling them, stay put. Don't try to get through those treacherous waters. So they decide to anchor off Cape Cod, and they fall on their knees and thank the God of heaven. But since it's not Virginia, some of the evil-thinking members of this crew start saying, well, we're not bound by the contract then. And a mutiny begins. So what happens here, November 11, 1620, is a historic moment in human history. They form one of the most remarkable documents in history, a forerunner to the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. A group of people pen and agree to their own civil body politic, a self-governing group. It's called the Mayflower Compact. You probably learned about it in grade school. So it's so historic because people themselves are deciding how to govern themselves. We the people becomes the first 3 words of the United States Constitution. This is unheard of in the old world where kings, hereditary monarchs, and popes rule and dictate people's lives, livelihood, and beliefs. It's a radical change from that top-down rule. Another way that this is fascinatingly different is that there were strangers and pilgrims, right? The pilgrims don't say to the strangers, well, you're under pilgrim rule and we're going to domineer over you. Everybody's equal before the law and casts votes. Now, we do know about subsequent Massachusetts history that they didn't become the most tolerant colony of all. That was reserved for Roger Williams' Rhode Island and William Penn's Pennsylvania with the Quaker and the Baptist colony there. But they became actually pluralistic societies, not solely Quaker and Baptist. But nonetheless, this was a beautiful way to bring people together and end that mutiny and form the foundation for later founding documents for America. Well, now we've got to explore this land. 16 men take the longboat ashore. They find some juniper for the cook's fires back on the ship, and springs of water miraculously right there on the shore. Just what they need. Then the women ride the longboat and start doing their washing with those fresh springs of water. By the way, this is November in New England. You might think that's cold water, and I know. These are minor hardships, though, compared to what's about to come. The soldier of the group, Miles Standish, takes a party of pilgrims then to explore the lay of the land. And they find, again miraculously, providentially, their provisions are gone, and they find a cache of corn, a storage of corn buried. And this saves their lives, literally. This had belonged to the Indians, and that might make us scratch our heads and be like, is this typical Western imperialistic conquest and theft and disrespect and all of that? And yeah, you would be forgiven for drawing that conclusion, because that is so commonly the tale of Western empires. But these pilgrims were remarkable. They were unique in history. They are the most faithful individuals you will find in this time of history. They say, praise God, our lives are saved. We're going to pay back to whatever Indian tribe these belong to every single year. We're going to make them large satisfaction, said Elder Brewster. Now, that's a rare thing in history. You might still judge that by contemporary times, but going back to those times, even amongst civilized nations, this sort of treatment and reciprocation would be unheard of, let alone to treat these savages who are normally dehumanized as subhuman. They're dignified as somebody worthy of us, calculating on a ledger every ear of corn and paying it back. But even with this cache of corn that they had found, they literally only have a quarter pound of cornbread for each member of the ship per day to survive on. And this is where the story gets tremendously dark. The winter was one of starvation, of scurvy, of sickness, of death. A quarter, and they got this little bit of bread, and you got these mothers with their children on the ship. What do you suppose those mothers are doing? They're sacrificing their bread for their children. 14 of the 18 mothers on the Mayflower perished during that winter. Can you believe that? Unbelievable sacrifice to forge for their children a land where they can worship according to the dictates of their conscience. Today, the historic site of Plymouth is the only place that I know of in the world. They brag this is the only place, the historic group there, that there is more than one statue of a woman. Because you could say the Pilgrim Mothers deserve even more credit than the Pilgrim Fathers for forging this through the ultimate sacrifice. And speaking of mothers, by the way, I got to get off that topic because that touches the heart when you've got kids. Take a deep breath. Speaking of mothers, this is a fun fact of history. Do you know who the first baby born in the New World was? Not Oceanus on the ocean. What was that baby's last name? Does anybody know it? If you've been to the historic site in Battle Creek, maybe you've heard this story. The baby was born of Susanna White. His name was Peregrine White. And about 2 centuries after Peregrine White came a man you all know named James White, the co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was a literal descendant of the first baby born on these shores from the Pilgrims. So that's a pretty neat, fun fact for us Adventists to look back on. But here we are in Plymouth. It's the winter. It's the wrong time of year to be arriving. It's the wrong place. We were supposed to be in Virginia. But there's water here. It's the only option. The Lord led us here, but what do we do during that dark winter? Only 4 families lost nobody to death. Literally half of those 102 Mayflower travelers, literally half of them died that winter. 50% of that voyage died that winter. They buried dozens of people in unmarked graves out of fear of Indians. They don't know what the Indian situation is just right here, but we'll see why they don't have anything to be afraid of in just a minute. But the ship captain, after this winter of starvation, invites the remaining survivors, just come back to England if you'd like. I'll take you back. You know how many of these 51 said we'd like to go back? Not a single one of them. This is what God has asked us to do, and we will press on. Now, how about those strangers, those crew? Well, so many of them are sick. They're not going back because somebody's caring for their sick. And it's not their drinking buddies, their fellow drinking buddies and crude, cruel fellows. It's the Pilgrims who are taken care of as the first medical missionaries in North America, taking care of their enemies who hated them, who threatened them. The first medical missionaries you could find there in Protestantism in the Western Hemisphere. William Bradford said there was but 6 or 7 sound persons. That's how sick these people were. There were only 6 or 7 healthy people. And Bradford was one of the sick. He says, to their great commendations be it spoken. They spared no pains, night or day, but with abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. In a word, did all ye homely and necessary offices for them which dainty and queasy stomachs could not endure to hear named. And all this willingly and cheerfully, without any grudging in ye least, showing herein their true love unto their friend and brethren. A rare example and worthy to be remembered. Now listen to this part. 2 of these 7 healthy medical missionaries, not trained as doctors, 2 of these 7 were Mr. William Brewster, their reverend elder, and Miles Standish, their captain and military commander, unto whom myself and many others were much holden in our low and sick condition. Will Bradford, back in England as a child, had been cared for by this hero, William Brewster. And we might think, well, he's just a pastor. He's just a lay pastor. I'm just I'm a manual laborer. I'm an accountant or whatever. I don't have the ability to help people with medical missionary needs and deeds of service. Elder Brewster, what a model for us all. Well, only one occasion did they have a problem with Indians. We'll see how the friendships formed, but I want to tell you about that occasion where there was a problem with certain Indians at this time. But why were there so few problems? This was actually one of the safest, if not the safest place on the entire American seaboard, eastern seaboard, for an English voyage to arrive in terms of relationship with Native Americans. 3 years before, in 1617, the warrior tribe, the very, very cruel tribe, the Patuxets, had been killed off by a plague. In 1617, wait a minute, Scott, I remember 1617 earlier. Something else was going on in the Netherlands in 1617 with William Brewster visiting England and laying plans about something, and then a vote that was taken. Oh yeah, that was the exact same year that the Lord's hand pointed them across the sea, and they began that commitment to make plans to 3 years later come to America after all of everything was set in order. That was the exact same time that the Lord, perhaps, and we'll find out in the millennium, the sin of the Amorites reached its full measure, or for whatever reason, God knows how to put his children mercifully to sleep. We don't put ourselves in the judge's position. But God had a mission to have the earth help out the woman. It needed to be a relatively sparsely populated place where peace could be forged between European and Native American. Revelation 17, verse 15, of course, referring to the waters representing the multitudes and the earth representing the place that would be helping out the woman. Now, there was that one time. What happened here? The Pilgrims were on their searching expedition, and they were assailed by an Indian attack. Arrows rained upon them. But, says William Bradford, by the special, there it is again, providence of God, none of the arrows either hit or hurt us. Though many came close by us, and some coats which hung upon our barricado were shot through and through. The fabric that was hanging there was shot, but the fabric that was hanging here wasn't shot. Isn't that providence right there? That's a beautiful thing. We'll see what tribe that is and who the friendly Indians at Thanksgiving are here in just a minute. But after the cold, dark winter, they now need to establish their colony. Let's go ashore. And they had lived in Leiden, Holland, in this town, this established city. So here they are in this, trying to establish a plantation on this rugged wilderness. I mean, this is country living at its most rugged, isn't it? And can you imagine homesteading here? So in the spring, the first building they build is a church, a meeting house, a common house to house some of them. And they would march to church to the beat of the drummers. Sunday observance for them at that time, as the light was yet to dawn on this present truth. There was a whole day affair. Elder Brewster was their minister, though he was not an ordained pastor. They would later have an ordained pastor 9 years later, but there was no formal school for the children either. But these New England children were some of the best educated you will find in history. Why? Well, their textbook was simply the Bible. And they studied the Bible with all depth and sincerity. On March 26, 1621, the Pilgrims are in a morning assembly together in the common house. The door swings open, and in walks a tall Indian who says, "Hello, Englishmen, me, Samoset." Do you know the story? They're thinking, what is this? He speaks English. He knows that he turned out he had made friends with Virginia colonists who had come up to New England to fish each year for many of the past 13 years now since the Jamestown colony was founded. He explains to the Pilgrims, the tribe that attacked you out of the blue as you were searching the land. They were the Nauset's tribe. They hate all Englishmen. There's a trader, slave trader named Thomas Hunt, a rather despicable figure in history who spoiled relationships for many well-meaning people like the Pilgrims. But Samoset and his people, the Wampanoags, they are more objective and fair than these rather warlike Indians that had attacked the Pilgrims. And so they become friends. The Pilgrims house Samoset that night as he made that gesture to stay with them, and then they bid him farewell the next morning. A few days later, he brings Squanto. Squanto actually had been a Christian convert. By God's providence, he had been one of the victims of the Thomas Hunt slave trading expeditions, had ended up being sold into slavery in Spain, ended up then in England later, how we don't know, but was converted to Christianity. His tribe was the tribe that was wiped out by the plague. He was the last remaining one and wasn't a brutal savage, was a friend of the Pilgrims as well. So he became an interpreter of the gospel to the natives, an amazing figure, Squanto. He lived with the Pilgrims, taught them how to grow corn. Have you ever heard of Three Sisters farming? Here's some country living nuggets for you. He lived with them how to, first you got to catch a fish, and then you take the fish and you bury it in the ground, because this terrible New England soil needs a little composting, a little nutrient additives here. Leave the fish in there for 2 weeks, then plant the corn. And then you'll see the corn growing up, then plant the beans, and the beans will have a stalk to climb right up with the corn, because you don't have cattle panels or whatever modern conveniences we have for climbing our beans. And then plant the squash, and that will cover the ground, keep the weeds down, and keep the moisture in case of drought. Bingo, Three Sisters farming, and you can also add some cabbage for nitrogen. This Squanto puts Michigan State University to shame with his knowledge that he knew at that time. A wonderful thing they learned. The peace treaty between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims was established with the great Chief Massasoit, and they coexisted. These two vastly different cultures coexisted in these lands for so long, for many decades, remarkable for these times. One of the unsung heroes of the Pilgrims was Edward Winslow, at one point Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe, their friendly tribe that they made the treaty with, was deathly sick. He said, "I'm going on an expedition to bring herbal remedies to him." He walked literally 40 miles with herbs to nurse him back to health. Halfway there, one of the tribesmen of the Native American tribe met him and said, "Don't bother, he's perishing." He said, "I'm going to press on. I will not stop until I've done everything I can for our friend, Chief Massasoit." He nursed him back to health, and Massasoit was saved, and the respect and friendship only grew. Edward Winslow said, "Where there is true love, there is no fear." Don't we need more of that today? Oh, what a beautiful thing. Winslow witnessed to the Indians of the gospel. They asked him, "Why do you pray like that before you eat?" Well, he said, "Whatsoever good things we had, we received them of God, as the author and giver thereof, and therefore craved his blessing on that we had, and were about to eat, that it might nourish and strengthen our bodies. And having eaten sufficient, being satisfied therewith, we again returned thanks to the same our God for that our refreshing." Did you know that they prayed at the end of the meal too? Maybe we should do that too, as a thanksgiving for what we have eaten. The Indian that he was witnessing to at that time said to him, "Well, we Wampanoags believe in a God as well. We don't call him God. We call him Kitatan." Mr. Winslow said, as they discussed the themes of morality and "thou shalt not murder," the 10 Commandments, he said, "I will never view the Indians as godless primitives again." And he went on with growing fervor to witness the Bible truth. He said to the Indian, "God's works of creation and preservation of his laws and ordinances, especially the 10 Commandments," he says, "they hearkened unto these biblical themes with great attention and liked well of." Well, these Native Americans, of course, had not had good experiences with Europeans like Thomas Hunt, and it was mixed with the Jamestown colonists. So it was rather remarkable that these tribesmen were able to overcome prejudice and look at these pilgrims as individuals and judge them by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And as for the pilgrims, they insisted on paying a fair and just price for everything in doing fair dealings with the natives. Anywhere that the plague had been, Indian tribes had abandoned, and that was considered fair game. But beyond that, Massasoit was consulted for every even land purchase, which was not a common thing, but they insisted on purchasing everything honestly and fairly. And Bradford himself wouldn't allow any Englishman to purchase any property or claim any property without getting Massasoit's permission personally. These true Christians, much like William Penn and Roger Williams, as I mentioned, are a model for peacemaking and for dealing with people who are different from us, who we might say are uncivilized or whatever. Through the spring and summer of 1621, that relationship deepened. The corn is growing, the vegetables are growing, and the friendship is growing. Often random parties would appear out of the woods into Plymouth Plantation. Indians would appear out of the woods, out of nowhere, and they would enjoy friendship and food and entertainment together and then go on their way. They became so close that certain pilgrim emissaries, when visiting the Wampanoags, slept in the same bed with Chief Massasoit. That's close friendship. I can't say there's a lot of guys that I'm friends with that I've done that with. But during a drought, there was need in the whole territory for rain. The pilgrims fasted and prayed with the Native Americans that God would send rain. And the rainfall came, providence and prophecy. This was the greatest harvest that these Indians had ever seen, the year of 1621, the year following the starving winter. When the harvest was in and the trees were gold and red and orange, the invitation went out for that big event we all know so well and celebrate every year, the great feast. Come, Wampanoags, join us for a harvest festival. 90 braves arrived to this. "Oh, sure, we'll take you up on that." Much to the surprise and consternation of the cooks, 90 of them. Well, there's so many, they see the quantity of food. The braves go out, these young men, and promptly get 5 more deer to contribute to the feast. It was that quick for them. Together, the pilgrims and the Indians sang at this first Thanksgiving. They played. They had fellowship and games. There was music and shooting exercises and plenty of laughter and fun together. Thanksgiving. Giving thanks, right? Isn't gratitude universal? It's a universal aspiration for every one of us. A mental health benefit as well, and a bond of peace. The Indians gave speeches of gratitude translated by Samoset and Squanto, and I think this story needs to be told more, not just this year, but every year, to heal the terrible divisions humanity sees on so many lines of fracture and destruction. Well, that exemplary relationship remained for decades. In 1630, an Indian was murdered by an English colonist, by 3 English colonists. The Indians expected this was the end of our peace. Oh, what has happened here? They're going to have a show trial and a miscarriage of justice. Is this going to break down the peace? Well, the English murderers were brought to Plymouth for trial. Oh, this is going to be a joke of a trial, think the Indians. But the judge, John Jenny by name, found these 3 English colonists guilty of bloodshed and hanged them for killing Indians. Who would have thought? And that wasn't the only occasion of its kind. It's exceptional in the history of this time, for sure. Another matter of justice that plagued the Plymouth colony in those early years, that the Pilgrim leadership learned through trial and error, was the common store method of divvying up the goods and services produced by the colony. They had lived a more or less communal existence. And so everybody was receiving the same pay regardless of their contribution and work and hard work. Productivity was lacking, and they were risking privation and even starvation. So in 1623, they learned pretty quickly. Bradford changes the deal. We're going to stop the communal existence and go to land ownership. Every family grows their own food. You do what you do best and then trade for the rest. You get the beginnings of the division of labor, before it was called that, before The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was published in 1776. But the principles of self-reliance, and if a man does not work, he shall not eat, and specialization of labor tripled their production in just those years when they began that history. Starvation became history. As the tidings spread through the countries of Europe, of a land where every man might enjoy the fruit of his labor. You see the theme there. And obey the convictions of his own conscience, the most important theme of all. Thousands flocked to the shores of the New World. Colonies rapidly multiplied. And that was not just Plymouth. This became a whole New England colonial settlement of various different kinds. Now, there's this potential danger of the hostile Indian tribe out there. What do we do as we've more developed our agricultural production? What do we do about defense? Because there is the potential of our blessed colony, our little city on a hill, becoming extinguished like others have been, like this lost colony of Roanoke, Virginia, prior to Jamestown. And so what happened here was they're in a leadership meeting and taking counsel with Elder Brewster and his fellow leaders. On the table before them is the big brass-studded Bible. Elder Brewster opens the Bible and reads, "Lift up the hands that hang down, and strengthen ye the feeble knees," he reads. "Thus saith the prophet Isaiah." Captain Standish replies, "Methinks this is the Lord's counsel to us, to arise and build a fort on the top of the mount, and there place our cannon. It will greatly set back our enemies." Elder Brewster replies, "Such a fort could serve as listen to that, a meeting house, and would greatly encourage our people in the worship of God." That was the focus. What can we do? Yes, defense, this is important in these times, but greatly encouraging our people in the worship of God. Plymouth has been called a city on a hill, a light to draw those coming out of the darkness of the dark ages to America. And truly, American history started there. I know Jamestown preceded it by 13 years, but this was where the principles were laid down. That Mayflower was a cargo ship bearing precious cargo of children and families and babies and godly, faithful followers of Christ. But the cargo that truly came across on the Mayflower were the ideas of liberty of conscience and all of the principles of this fair republic. You read in 1 Testimonies 2:64 that God has the destiny of this nation in his hands. And it goes beyond the Pilgrim's story. I wish I could do just like all of American history for you. Can I give you a sketch of post-Pilgrim stuff that also shows the destiny of God in this nation's hand, this nation being in God's hands? I'm telling you, miracles in the founding of this country. An answered prayer. One of the most interesting answered prayer came 3 centuries later, almost, here with George Washington Carver. I wish I had the time to tell his whole story. Everybody should know the story of George Washington Carver. But did you know that his genius in developing all these uses for a peanut came in answer to prayer? Listen to how he put it in North Carolina in 1920 at a speech he gave. Years ago, I went into my laboratory and said, "Dear Mr. Creator, please tell me what the universe was made for." Forgive me if you've heard this before. You got to hear it again. The great Creator answered, "You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask for something more your size, little man." Then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, tell me what man was made for." Again, the great Creator replied, "You are still asking too much." So then I asked, "Please, Mr. Creator, will you tell me why the peanut was made?" "That's better. But even that's infinite. What do you want to know about the peanut?" "Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut?" You've heard of nut milk before, haven't you? Almond milk? And then the great Creator taught me how to take the peanut apart and put it together again. And out of the process have come forth all these products. Have come forth. Not I. He's giving glory to God, isn't he? It's an answer to prayer. He said it again before the House Ways and Means Committee. If you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, "Behold, I have given you every herb that bears seed. To you it shall be for meat." This is what he means about it. It shall be meat. There is everything there in plant foods. There is everything there to strengthen and nourish and keep the body alive and healthy. You didn't think you'd get a health nugget during the talk on history, did you? The chairman then asks him, "Dr. Carver, where did you learn all these things?" He answers, "From an old book." The chairman asks, "What book?" Dr. Carver insists, "The Bible." Chairman, "Does the Bible talk about peanuts?" "No, sir, but it tells about the God who made the peanut." I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did. An answer to prayer and some of the most innovative inventions in American history. Now, the founding era was one of my favorite to teach when I taught school. Many miracles. Before 1776, you had war between Britain and France, King George's War. And there's a man in this war named George Washington, as a British man at the time. Now, before I tell you about George Washington, I got to tell you about a storm. New France's Louisburg had fallen to the British in 1745. You got a world war between Britain and France, and American colonists are caught up in this. This is in Nova Scotia, the third busiest seaport in North America, but the French are going to try to reconquer that now, and while they're at it, they're going to try to conquer Boston. Now, what's going on in Boston? Well, Reverend Thomas Prince hears about the French assault on the city that is coming, and he prays, "Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters. Scatter the ships of our tormentors," with this ominous French fleet approaching. Well, historian Catherine Drinker Bowen explains that after he finished praying, we don't know the intervening period, but the sky darkened, the winds shrieked, the church bells rang an uneven sound, though no man was in the steeple, and a hurricane scattered the French fleet as far as the Caribbean. Lightning struck, exploding powder kegs on the ships of the French fleet, and Boston was spared. The 7 Years' War preceded in the 1750s, going on with war between Britain and France that was on and off for decades. At this time, British Colonel George Washington was in a battle where the British were absolutely slaughtered and annihilated by the French and the Indians. George Washington was the only officer who survived that onslaught. How is it that the one officer that survived became such an important figure who you'll even hear mentioned in the Spirit of Prophecy, in the testimonies? He's mentioned as a man with order and system and intentionality is my word. But anyway, he says, I have been protected in that battle. I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companies on every side of me. So yeah, providence and protection. Later in the Revolutionary War, this same George Washington, there was a time where the American troops were retreating. He did not call for a retreat. He needed them back on the firing line. He literally rides out on his horse in between the British and the American lines and turns his back to British, who are the enemy at this point of his cause, and he shouts to his men, "Halt, then fire." And he's now in between the firing on both sides. The field is filled with smoke, and the air clears. And there's Washington, alive and waving his men forward. Incredible stories of miraculous protection and provision. Do you know who this lady is? She's a war hero. My favorite war heroes are the ones who didn't even bear arms, like her. Clara Barton, during the Civil War. I know I'm in the founding period right now, but I'm just jumping to people who should have been shot but weren't. Clara Barton was the founder of the American Red Cross. She was delivering relief supplies to wounded soldiers and aiding in the search for missing soldiers. This lady was carrying a wounded soldier, and while doing that, she explains, a ball or a bullet had passed between my body and the right arm which supported him, cutting through the sleeve and passing through his chest, tragically, from shoulder to shoulder. There was no more to be done for him, and I left him to his rest. I have never mended that hole in my sleeve. And she went on to speculate, do soldiers ever mend the holes in their garments? What a miraculous protection of the Lord. She, by the way, later cared for the wounded on both sides of that conflict, proving love your enemy. I won't retell the story of the great Desmond Doss, but all who are familiar with that, which most of you probably are, know that this is nothing short of miraculous providential protection as well. Now back to the War for Independence, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Was this just a coincidence that the first naval engagement in the War for Independence, the British just so happened to have the wrong size cannonballs for their cannons, and they couldn't bombard the American position or the city of Boston with their cannon fire? So 2,300 British soldiers have to disembark, try to engage in man-to-man combat on the shore, and they endure twice as many casualties as the American colonists. Later, the British held siege against the colonists in Boston. Siege means they are starving out the inhabitants. This is a messy business here, cruel and destructive and satanic in nature. British General Howe planned to have 3,000 troops charge Dorchester Heights, as it was called, but before he could have his troops charge the American colonists and finish them off, a violent storm caused turbulent seas and the prevention of the landing of these 3,000 troops. The way Washington put it was that this most remarkable interposition of Providence is for some wise purpose. I have no doubt. New York was the next target of the British. They planned the largest land invasion force in Western military history up till that point. 32,000 troops, 400 ships. Out in the harbor, there are masts of ships like tree trunks in New York Harbor. And Washington says, we are not, in men or in arms, prepared for it. Providence will still go on to afford us aid. If the earth is going to help out the woman and the land like beasts will rise, you think God will foresee this event? The date is July 9, 1776. That sounds a little like July 4, 1776, doesn't it? 5 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. A copy of this declaration is brought to Washington before the onslaught of the British, and they read to the soldiers, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They were firmly relying on divine providence. But now they must escape. The miraculous retreat across the East River by night. 10,000 British troops had landed elsewhere, trapped them between the sea and that oncoming force. An urgent retreat is needed. The waters of the East River, mysteriously calm, but out where the British ships are, especially boisterous. Half of Washington's forces make it across by night, but he's got many more that need to get across yet. Half of them yet to go, and its day is breaking. Are they going to be trapped and slaughtered? Well, a mysterious, can I stop using that word? A providential, this isn't coincidence, is it? A providential thick fog rests upon the area to mask the rest of the escape, and they can escape without detection. Ben Talmadge, Washington's chief of intelligence, said a very dense fog seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. Wow. Then the Battle of Saratoga, the turning point as we cruise toward the end. This is where the British lost 6,000 soldiers, where the where the Americans had the definitive battle at the turning point of the war, and Elihu Yale says, this is God's providence. I'll speed up a little bit. A signal stroke of providence, George Washington said, at the casualty rate that's just undeterminable mathematically through probability alone. They held their first national Thanksgiving there in 1777, a little different than ours, but the Americans were put on starving ships. Literally, that's what they are. Like 11,000 Americans captured and put on starving ships, starved to death, all of them, to a person. There were another 11,000 that were trapped in Valley Forge in the winter and at unseasonably cold December, as if December is supposed to be warm. And at this time, 2,500 Americans from all states, from all walks of life, even various races at this place, bound together, pledging their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor, ages 12 on up to 60. That's how desperate the Continental Army was for soldiers, freezing to death, limbs black and amputated, when these people gave so much, sacrifice even their lives for the cause. The final act in defeat, the Battle of Cowpens, another miracle story, where then they need to escape. This is even fine. I know I'm skipping over the Battle of Cowpens, but you got to hear this one. The Americans are now retreating this way after a definitive battle. Basically, they're declaring victory in the Revolutionary War, but the British have one last effort here, and the Americans cross a river. And right after crossing, a flash flood, the river rises, the British slow down and can't get across the river. Then they go another across a second river. Same thing happens. What are the chances? What are the chances? Even the British commanders said this was miraculous that this happened. They're like, yep, God's on the side of the Americans. And by the way, this is not to baptize American militarism and imperialism that would subsequently take place, of course, as some sort of Christian crusade. But you understand, prophecy needed to be fulfilled. We have abundant reasons, said Washington, to thank Providence many, many times over. Well, maybe another time I'll talk about the French Revolution versus the American Revolution, the difference between those, and how the great controversy refers to our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, as that grand old document that said all men are created equal. And it took some time for those words to be actualized, as we know. But indeed, those principles fostered the most free and independent land the world has ever seen, and out of which the Bible societies and the missionary societies and the Advent movement were able to flourish. And isn't that what this is all about? The earth helping out the woman. This isn't about a nation. This isn't about a civil government. This is about a land where the gospel could go forth, and we have the privilege to do that work. One last, this is fun, War of 1812. The British are burning buildings in Washington. The White House is being torched. Guess what happens? Oh, the most tempestuous rainstorm that they have ever seen begins to put out the fire. A tornado scatters the British, tears down trees, floods the roads with mud where they think they're going to escape now after their destruction of D.C. Baltimore is also being bombarded from the outside. And that same storm that had helped the Americans out in the War of 1812 in D.C. moves to Baltimore, floods the ground. The cannonballs are falling in mud, not exploding at nearly the rate that they should. And the Battle of New Orleans, more miracles with Andrew Jackson. He just like Washington, bullets flying this way and that. And commentators are like, these men have not been made to die of a bullet. An assassin came to him with not one but two pistols when he was president, shot them both. They both misfired. What are the chances of that? He said, a kind of providence has been protecting me. Now, the closing quote, I needed to cruise to this one because you know our American Civil War, God's hands were guiding, because you know this from Inspiration, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1. God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery and has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. At the conference at Roosevelt, New York, August 3, 1861, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us. And I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery, which has so long been a curse to this nation. The North and the South were presented before me. So this is when the Civil War is beginning. The North has been deceived in regard to the South. The South are better prepared for war than has been represented. Most of their men are well skilled in the use of arms, some of them from experience in battle, others from habitual sporting. They have the advantage of the North in this respect, but have not, as a general thing, the valor and the power of endurance that the northern men have. I had a view of the disastrous battle at Manassas, Virginia, which if you read the historical accounts of the battle at Manassas, Virginia, it's kind of confusing and perplexing to make sense of until you read the pen of inspiration. It was a most exciting, distressing scene, she explains. The Southern army had everything in their favor and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern army was moving on with triumph, not doubting but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. These are the Northerners, and they neared the battlefield. Many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into the battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little while would have been driven back still further. The Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended. Have you read this before? This is amazing. An angel descended and waved his hand backward. Instantly, there was confusion in the ranks. It appeared to the Northern men that their troops were retreating when it was not so in reality, and a precipitate retreat commenced. This seemed wonderful to me. God arranged for the retreat of the Northern soldiers. Then it was explained. God explains, the angel explains why this happened. Well, God has this nation in his own hand, and God would not suffer victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and would permit no more losses to the Northern men than in his wisdom he saw it fit to punish them for their sins. The loss at Manassas, Virginia was a divine judgment for the North tolerating slavery for so long. You had the Fugitive Slave Act. You had terrible things transpiring. And had the Northern army at this time pushed the battle still further in their fainting, exhausted condition, the far greater struggle and destruction which awaited them would have caused great triumph in the South. So God didn't let it go beyond what it could have. God would not permit this and sent an angel to interfere. The sudden falling back of the Northern troops is a mystery to all. They know not that God's hand was in the matter. Isn't history his story? God's hand is in the matter throughout history, and I hope that gives us greater confidence in going forward. We have prophecy, we have providence, and we can rely on both with full confidence in the God of heaven who has all power to do all things according to his will. Do you put yourself in his hands today?